The morning Sylvia Crane walked out of the probate hearing, she had exactly $43 in her checking account, a 7-year-old son named Eli waiting at her sister's apartment across town, and nothing else. Not nothing in the dramatic sense people use when they want sympathy. Nothing in the literal sense. The house her mother had promised her was signed over to her stepbrother, Lawrence. The savings account her mother had mentioned in 3 separate phone calls, "It's for you and Eli, Sylvia, you know that," had already been transferred months before the death. Perfectly legal, perfectly untouchable. Even the small jewelry box her mother had kept on the dresser since Sylvia was a child was gone. Lawrence had moved fast, he always moved fast. She stood in the marble hallway of the Cuyahoga County Courthouse and didn't cry. She had already used up her tears somewhere around midnight the week before, sitting on the floor of her rented bathroom while Eli slept, reading the same legal document 17 times and understanding it better with every read. There was nothing to misunderstand. She had simply lost. Lawrence came out of the hearing room behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. He had their mother's eyes and none of her warmth. His attorney, a man named Forsyth, who wore shoes that cost more than Sylvia's monthly rent, said something quietly to him, and they both laughed at something that wasn't audible. It didn't need to be. "You know," Lawrence said, stopping beside her as if they were having a casual conversation at a family dinner, "Mom always said you were the practical one." He smiled. "Guess not." Sylvia looked at him. She didn't say anything. There was a version of herself that wanted to list every loan she'd never asked her mother to repay. Every holiday she'd driven 4 hours to be there. Every Sunday call. Every emergency she'd shown up for, while Lawrence was traveling or busy or simply unavailable. But that version of herself was tired. And anyway, Lawrence already knew all of it. That was the thing about people like Lawrence. They knew exactly what they were taking. "Take care of yourself," he said, and walked toward the elevator. His attorney glanced back once. Something in the look wasn't quite contempt. More like the mild curiosity a person feels watching a stranger trip on a curb. Then the elevator doors closed. Sylvia stood in the hallway for another moment. Around her, courthouse staff moved between rooms. A young couple argued in hushed voices near the water fountain. A security guard checked his phone. Life continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to the fact that hers had just been rearranged in ways she didn't yet fully understand. She picked up her bag, straightened her coat, and walked toward the exit. What Lawrence didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Sylvia had spent the last 4 years building something. Not loudly. Not in a way that invited attention or conversation or the particular kind of interest that comes from people who want to be adjacent to success. She'd built it the way she did most things, quietly, methodically, and during the hours that no one else was using. It had started out of necessity. After Eli's father left, when Eli was 2, Sylvia had lost her position at the architecture firm during a round of layoffs that hit 6 months later. She'd taken a job at a property management company, then another doing drafting work for a small contractor, then started taking freelance projects at night after Eli went to bed. Her dining room table was perpetually covered in blueprints. She kept 3 different design software subscriptions and knew how to use all of them better than people who'd been trained specifically for that purpose. Around the time Eli turned 4, a former colleague named Patrick had reached out about a residential development project in a mid-sized city 2 hours south. He needed someone to design 12 homes that would actually sell, in a market where everything looked the same. She had stayed up until 2 in the morning for 3 months on that project, refining details that most developers would never notice and buyers always would. Ceiling heights, natural light placement, the way a kitchen feels at 7 in the morning versus 7 at night. The home sold in 11 days. All 12. Patrick called her the morning after the last one closed. "I don't know what you did," he said, "but I need you to do it again." She had done it again, and again after that. She and Patrick had formalized their arrangement 2 years ago, though arrangement was a modest word for what it had become. The firm they'd structured together, quiet, unlisted, operating through a parent company, Sylvia had incorporated on a Tuesday afternoon when Eli was at school. Had completed 27 projects across 4 states. The most recent valuation, done by a financial advisory group Patrick had brought in 6 months earlier, had put their combined equity at just under $40 million. $40 million. A number that still felt theoretical when she thought about it. She kept $43 in her checking account, because she kept her personal finances lean and separate and always had. The money was real. It was simply somewhere. Lawrence would never think to look for it. Because Lawrence had never thought much about Sylvia at all. Outside the courthouse, the October air was sharp and direct. A few people stood near the bottom of the steps. A man on a phone call. A woman reading something on her tablet. A group of law students moving past in a cluster of dark coats. Sylvia came down the steps and stopped to put on her gloves. She wasn't in a hurry. She had promised Eli she'd pick him up by noon and she had time. Sylvia. She turned. Lawrence had come back out through the revolving door, his attorney just behind him. He looked slightly less composed than he had upstairs, which was interesting. I just wanted to say, look, I know this wasn't easy. He said it in the tone of a person who has been advised to say something conciliatory by counsel. But Mom made her choices. We have to respect that. Sylvia put on her second glove. Okay, and if you ever need anything. He paused on the word, letting it sit there without being specific, which was the entire point of it. The offer that costs nothing because it's never intended to cost anything. I'm all right, she said. Lawrence studied her for a moment. There was something in her composure that unsettled him, she could tell. He had expected something different. Tears, maybe, or anger. Anger would have been easier, more familiar, something he could dismiss. But she was just standing there, calm and gloved and apparently unbothered, and it didn't fit the story he had told himself about what this morning meant. Okay, he said finally. Well, take care. He turned to go, and then they heard it. It was faint at first. A low rhythmic sound somewhere above the city noise, above the traffic and the distant construction on 9th Street, and the general ambient hum of a weekday morning downtown. A few people looked up without knowing why, the way you do when something changes in the frequency of the air around you. Then it got louder. From between two office buildings to the north, a helicopter emerged. Dark gray, sleek. Moving with the unhurried confidence of something that did not need to announce itself. It descended in a wide arc over the courthouse square, displacing a column of cold air that sent fallen leaves skittering across the pavement. People stopped. The man on his phone call looked up and forgot what he was saying. The law students halted mid-sentence. Even Forsyth, the attorney, shielded his eyes and looked. The helicopter landed in the open plaza at the edge of the courthouse grounds. On the wide flat section near the parking structure that the city had once designated for emergency vehicle access, it settled with a precision that spoke of a pilot who had done this many times before. For a moment no one moved. Then the side door opened and a man in a dark jacket stepped out, walked directly across the plaza toward the courthouse steps, and stopped in front of Sylvia. Miss Crane, he said. Mr. Ellison asked me to let you know we're ready when you are. He's on the call with the Portland group until 11:30, but he said to go ahead and depart, and he'll join you at the site by 1. Sylvia nodded. Tell him that's fine. And tell him Eli's coming, so we'll need the second car at the airfield. Already arranged, the man said. He smiled. Mr. Ellison anticipated that he would, Sylvia said, with a tone of someone who had worked alongside Patrick Ellison long enough to know that he anticipated most things. The man, whose name was Jerome, and who had been Patrick's personal assistant for 6 years, walked back toward the helicopter. The plaza was very quiet. Lawrence was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, with his coat half-buttoned and his attorney beside him. And for a long moment he did not speak. His face had gone through several distinct expressions in the space of about 15 seconds, and none of them were ones he'd have chosen to display in public. That's, he stopped. Patrick's helicopter. Sylvia said pleasantly. Well, one of the firms. We have 3 actually, but this is the one the pilots prefer for city landings. Better in tight spaces. Lawrence looked at her, then he looked at the helicopter, then back at her. Sylvia, what? I should go, she said. I need to pick up Eli before we head to the airfield. Forsyth said something to Lawrence in a low voice. Lawrence ignored him. What is this? Lawrence asked. His voice had changed register. It was no longer the easy, practiced tone of someone holding all the cards. It was the voice of a person doing rapid recalculation. What firm? What are you talking about? Sylvia looked at him for a moment. She thought about the question, and she thought about all the times over the past 4 years she might have answered it, if anyone had thought to ask. Sunday dinners where Lawrence talked about his portfolio and his contacts and his deals, while Sylvia listened, and said little, because no one directed the conversation her way. The Christmas call where her mother had mentioned, almost as an aside, that Sylvia seemed to be doing fine with her little projects. The assumption, shared and never examined, that Sylvia was managing, just managing, while real things happened elsewhere, to other people. You never asked, she said simply. Not with bitterness. Just as a statement of fact. Then she walked across the plaza toward Jerome and the helicopter. Her heels precise and unhurried on the pavement. Her coat catching the cold wind off the lake. She picked Eli up from her sister Dana's apartment at 11:15. He came out of the building at a run, backpack bouncing, wearing the blue jacket he insisted on even though it was too thin for the weather. Mom. He grabbed her hand. Did it go okay? Ellie was 7, and understood more than she sometimes wished he did. He'd heard her on the phone enough times in the past to know that something was happening with his grandmother's estate, and that it involved Uncle Lawrence and that it was not going well. He hadn't asked for details. He just started leaving her coffee notes. Small pieces of paper folded in half and left on the kitchen counter, with things written on them like "You're doing great," and "I believe in you, Mom," in his careful second-grade handwriting. She had kept every one of them. It went okay, she told him, which was the truth she thought, in the ways that mattered. And now we're going to the site. He had heard about the Portland project in the abstract, a large mixed-use development that the firm had been contracted to design. A project that was, in Patrick's words, the kind of thing that redefines a career. "We are," she said, "we're flying." Ely looked up at her. Like, flying. Helicopter to the airfield, then the plane from there. He processed this. "Do I have to do homework on the plane?" "Yes." He sighed the sigh of a person carrying a great burden, but he was smiling. Dana had appeared in the doorway of the building, arms crossed, watching. She'd been Sylvia's closest person through all of it. The late nights. The legal consultations. The months of uncertainty. She hadn't known the full scope of what the firm had become, because Sylvia was private by nature and because she hadn't wanted to complicate things with anyone until it was settled. But Dana was perceptive in the way of people who have watched someone they love work very hard for a very long time. "You okay?" Dana called. Sylvia looked at her sister and felt, for the first time since she had walked into the courthouse that morning, something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly. Something quieter, like a door opening onto a room that had always been hers. "Yeah," she said, "we're good." The airfield was 40 minutes south of the city. Eli fell asleep in the back of the car before they got to the highway. His forehead pressed against the window and his backpack on his lap, mouth slightly open. Sylvia sat in the front and watched the city turn to suburbs, then to flat open land, and she let herself think for a little while. She thought about her mother, not with anger. That had burned itself out slowly over the past several months, and left behind something she could live with, which was mostly just sadness. Her mother had loved her. She believed that without qualification. But her mother had also been, in the particular way of people who have lived through difficult things, more comfortable with Lawrence's version of strength. Visible, loud, decorated, than with Sylvia's. Sylvia's kind of strength didn't announce itself. It didn't make for good conversation at the dinner table. You couldn't point to it and explain it to someone in a sentence. You could only see it from the outside. At a certain distance, after enough time had passed. She thought about what Lawrence's face had looked like in the plaza. That specific sequence of expressions. The confusion, then the recalculation, then something she could only describe as disorientation. As if the map he had been using didn't match the territory he was standing in. She didn't feel triumphant about it. That surprised her a little, but it was true. What she felt was something more like clarification. Like finally being seen accurately, even by someone she had largely given up on. Not vindication, just accuracy. The helicopter had been Patrick's idea actually. He had a standing arrangement to use it for site visits in the city, and had offered it weeks ago, before the hearing was even scheduled. Because Patrick was the kind of person who thought about logistics in advance. It hadn't been staged. It hadn't been timed. The fact that it landed when it did, was simply the result of Sylvia telling Jerome the hearing should be done by 10:30, and Jerome arriving accordingly. If Lawrence hadn't come back out of the courthouse for that second conversation, he never would have seen it at all. That, she thought, was its own kind of lesson. Lawrence had come back to say something conciliatory that wasn't conciliatory, and in doing so had given himself a front row seat to something he hadn't planned on witnessing. There was probably a word for that. Some old word from a language that paid attention to the shapes that irony takes. She didn't know what it was. It didn't matter. Patrick was at the Portland site by the time they arrived. He was a tall, broad man in his 50s with reading glasses, perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and the disposition of someone who had learned, over many years, to stay calm in the presence of complicated problems. He was the one who had seen early on that Sylvia didn't just design buildings. She understood what made people feel at home in them, which was a different and rarer skill. He met them at the car. Eli, now awake and recalibrated, offered him the extremely serious handshake he had been practicing recently. "Mr. Ellison," Patrick returned it with equal gravity. "Mr. Crane, good flight?" "Yeah, we had turbulence over the mountains but I wasn't scared." "Neither was I," Patrick said. Eli seemed satisfied with this. He went to stand at the edge of the construction site's viewing area, where a chain link fence bordered a vista of half-built structures stretching across several city blocks, and looked out with the concentrated attention of a child who has learned to take things seriously because someone he loves does. Patrick stood beside Sylvia. "How did it go?" "He got everything," she said. "I know. Forsyth called someone who called someone." Patrick paused. "I'm sorry, Sylvia. I know you are. The partnership offer still stands," he said. "If you're ready to make it official." She had known this was coming. They had been building toward it for 2 years, a formal restructuring that would put her name on the firm's documentation as equal partner. Not consultant, not design director, but equal partner. She had delayed it while the estate situation was unresolved, wanting to keep things clean. There was no reason to delay it now. "I'm ready," she said. Patrick nodded. He looked out at the site. "This one's going to be something." "I know," she said. "I designed it." He laughed, and the sound carried across the construction site, and Eli looked back from the fence with the small automatic smile of a child who hears his parent happy. Months passed. And then, more months, and the Portland project became the kind of development that gets written about in industry publications and visited by people who want to understand how a mixed-use neighborhood can feel like it was always supposed to be there. The firm's name was on it now. Crane Ellison Design. And Sylvia's name was the one that architects mentioned when they were trying to explain what the design got right. She moved Eli into a house with a real yard, in a neighborhood with good schools, and neighbors who kept their lights on at night and remembered your name when they saw you. It was a modest house by the standards of what she could have afforded. But she had chosen it because of the kitchen's morning light, and the way the back porch caught the afternoon, which were the things she had spent years designing for other people. She didn't hear much from Lawrence. She had expected, half expected, some kind of contact, a phone call, a letter, maybe an email carefully worded to imply that she owed him something or that there was still an avenue for relationship. It didn't come. This told her something about Lawrence that she hadn't fully known before. That his interest in her had always been contingent. Which meant it was not really interest at all. She was not, in the end, angry about the inheritance. She had been, for a while, not the quiet held-in kind of angry but the actual kind, the kind that wakes you up at night and sits on your chest, but that passed the way most things pass gradually, and then completely, replaced by something harder to name but more useful to live with. What she carried instead was this. A clear understanding that the people who underestimate you do not do it accidentally. They do it because it is easier than paying attention. Because paying attention requires a kind of care that costs something, and not everyone is willing to pay that. She had paid it. She had paid it in late nights and early mornings and years of work that no one saw because she hadn't needed them to see it. She had paid it for Eli, and for herself. And because the alternative was a kind of smallness she had never been able to accept. Eli, for his part, grew in the way that children grow when someone is genuinely paying attention to them. Not toward what was expected, but toward what was true. He was curious and particular and gentle with things that were fragile. He had a tendency to ask questions that took adults a moment to answer. He kept a notebook, where he wrote down things he found interesting, and sometimes Sylvia would come across it on the kitchen table, and read a few pages, and feel something in her chest that she suspected was the particular pride of watching a person become themselves. On the evenings when work was slow and dinner was done, and Eli was finishing his homework at the kitchen table, she would sit across from him with her own work, or sometimes just with coffee and nothing particular to do. And the house would be quiet, in the way that a house is quiet when the people in it are content. The kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that's full of small sounds, pencil on paper, the refrigerator cycling, the distant sound of the neighborhood settling into night. Those evenings were not dramatic. They were not the kind of thing that makes for a good story, or a good headline, or a moment that someone might point to and say, "There, that's when things changed." But they were. Sylvia had come to understand the whole point. Everything she had built, the firm, the reputation, the long careful years of work that Lawrence had never bothered to notice, had been built so that she could sit in this kitchen in the evening, with her son and not be afraid. She had walked out of the courthouse, with nothing that Lawrence thought mattered. She had walked toward everything that did.